Recently, I reread my favorite Canadian novel by my favorite author, Hugh MacLennan, Two Solitudes, my third read through. I first read this novel when I was 17. It was for an English class. We had an independent reading project while everyone else was picking up Tess of the D'Urbervilles and A Tale of Two Cities and Oliver Twist. Basically anything literary that the teacher recommended. I picked up Two Solitudes in a slightly abridged version. Students had used it in the past for this specific project. It had to be a comparative essay, so we were to read two novels. I picked Two Solitudes first, paired it with Roger Lemlin's The Town Below, wrote an essay based on that, but it was my first real experience with Canadian literature, unless you want to count L.M. Montgomery or the children's writing of Gordon Corman or Life of Pi. My last year of high school was really when I discovered CanLit. Along with Two Solitudes that year, I read Robertson Davies' Fifth Business, so it was a good year for reading, but I have long loved this novel. I gave it a reread last year and another reread this year. My most recent reread was with Janelle from The Page Turner, and she posted her own review yesterday, a very good review. I'll leave the link to that in the description and you can go watch that. But as I said, this is my favorite novel. I have this edition, Macmillan paperback. I have the edition that I read this time around, my first edition. First time I've read my first edition. I chose it because Janelle also had a first edition from her local library, and I wanted to ensure that we were reading the same edition. Then there's the paperback copy that I bought for myself. I had an interesting surprise when I was reading this in high school. For my paper, I read a copy from the library initially, went out and bought my own copy and discovered that a third of the book was missing in the one that I'd read originally. When it was put into an edition for the classroom, an editorial choice was made to cut off the last third of the novel. I'll explain that more later on, but I also have this edition. So as I said, my favorite novel, and I reread that recently. I've been working my way through a biography of Hugh MacLennan, Hugh MacLennan, A Writer's Life by Elspeth Cameron. Some interesting insights on Two Solitudes as a novel in there. Also, I feel like I need to show this off. This is my new journal to be taking booktube notes in. So I started on the first page, and as you can see, it is property of From the Dusty Bookshelf. I bought it and then I had to do something with it, so this is what I'm doing with it. Two Solitudes is an iconic Canadian novel. It is, I think, the dust jacket to this biography I'm reading. Sorry, I left it off, but the dust jacket to the biography I'm reading says that MacLennan was our first truly non-colonial writer, writing faithfully out of his own perceptions of his land and his people. In this way, his writing has reached beyond geographical boundaries and belongs both to Canada and to a universal area of literature. His books will endure. Our first truly non-colonial writer. Hugh MacLennan was big about moving literature in Canada from regional literature, from literature that was mimicking British literature or French literature or American literature, to something you could call Canadian literature. And it's commonly accepted that that's what he did with his novel, Two Solitudes. It was his second novel, Barometer Rising, was published a few years earlier. Unfortunately, due to the publishing climate, and taxation laws in Canada at the time. He had to go to the States to have that published by an American publisher. It was then imported into Canada, a high tax on that. So despite the fact that he had a wildly successful novel in Barometer Rising, he was unable to sustain himself off the proceeds of his novel. And so he ended up working as a teacher, as a professor, and he wanted to leave that life behind because he knew that he was not meant to be a school teacher. He did not want to be a professor. And so when he started in on Two Solitudes, he knew that this novel was it. This was the novel that had to make it big if he wanted to be able to pursue his dream and pursue a life as a writer, to quit his day job, basically. For this reason, parts of Two Solitudes come across as a little rushed. In the biography I'm reading, Hugh MacLennan himself admitted that more revision would have been beneficial to the novel. In fact, the first 2/3 and the last third seem almost disjointed. MacLennan could have done better. The novel itself is focused on the Tallard family. The first 2/3 or so focus mainly on Anthony Tallard, the father of Paul Tallard, who Hugh MacLennan said the novel was really about. For him, the focus of the novel was Paul Tallard. But that's not how the novel comes across. For the first 2/3, Anthony's is the one that you identify with. Anthony's is French-Canadian. He's a parliamentarian. He is a very important figure in his community. He's wealthy, but he finds life unfair. He believes that his people, his parish, French-Canadians, must find a way to enter the business community in which they are at a disadvantage, or else Anglo-Canadians, Americans too, will continue to take the wealth, continue to hold. It's about capitalism, really. They'll continue to hold the power. They'll continue to have control of the methods of production. This novel was written before the Quiet Revolution in Quebec, so the Catholic Church still had a very strong hold on society as a whole. For French Canadians at this time, the Catholic Church, the agricultural lifestyle, large families, lots of children, that Catholic agricultural lifestyle was really the cornerstone of the way they lived. And to go against that would be to go against your own people. And even though Anthony's believes that he's doing his own people a favor, and perhaps in the long run he is, he's seen as a traitor by the people in his parish and by the local father, the Catholic Church. He finds himself ostracized, and his son Paul, who this novel is supposedly about, the last third of it is about him anyway, Paul finds himself torn between two identities. Anthony had already rocked the boat a little by marrying his second wife, an Irish-Canadian woman. His first wife was a French-Canadian woman, a Franco-Canadian, and his elder son, Marius, is Franco-Canadian, very religious, very traditional. But Paul finds himself torn between this Anglo-Canadian world that his father enters and this Franco-Canadian world that he was born into, that his brother is a part of. He can speak both languages fluently without an accent, but he feels as though he doesn't really belong entirely in either world. There's one specific scene where he says that he feels like he's living in the waiting room of a railroad station. Apparently, MacLennan meant the novel to be about Paul. He had the image of Paul first, and then he wanted to give Paul a backstory. How did he get to be this man torn between two identities? How did he get to be this hybrid of the French and Canadian identity? How did he get to be this bridge between the two? How did he get to form this new identity that he must learn to live with? How did Paul become the future of the Canadian identity? And MacLennan put together the story of the Tallard family, of Anthony's, and of Marius, and of Kathleen, and McQueen, who interestingly is a capitalist involved, he's the businessman. McQueen sounds very much like King, and according to the biography I'm reading, that could be a jab at former Canadian Prime Minister Mackenzie King. I would also interpret it as a bit of a jab at the British monarchy. But when it comes down to it, the meaning of this novel really rests in Paul. Paul mirrors, in a way, MacLennan's own life, his own struggle for identity, his own coming of age. It is a coming of age story in the end. Paul not only discovers himself, discovers his passion for writing, discovers what Canadian literature needs to be, but he discovers a way to move forward. A way where he can go to the United States and spend time there without feeling like a traitor. He can come back to Canada and be English, be French, speak English. He is, in essence, the future. I'm fairly certain that some of you watching this have a question about the title, The Two Solitudes. What I believed for many years after I had read this, Two Solitudes, the tension between French and English Canada. Of course, but recently in reading that biography, I discovered that I wasn't wrong, but I wasn't completely right either. I was only brushing the surface of that. It is about the tension, but the title refers also to the whole, to the love between those two solitudes, to the methods of survival made possible by those two solitudes. I'm just going to open this up to page 177. Oops, I'm stuck in the precipice. That's one of his later novels. But 177. So this is the way that Elspeth conveys the story of how MacLennan got the title of this novel. He was reading a review in the New York Times of a relatively insignificant novel, which concluded by saying this writer might accomplish something if he could begin to understand the truth of Rilke's statement, that love consists in this, that two solitudes protect and touch and greet each other. And that in itself gives extra significance to the final passage of Two Solitudes. You know what, I won't read the final passage, but the final passage has French and English Canada preparing to enter another great war together, preparing to go hand in hand, essentially, into the Second World War. Now, this novel was published in 1945. After that Second World War, a large chunk of it is set during the First World War, and that First World War, I think, is part of why the novel did so well in Canada. In discussing the First World War, MacLennan discusses the Second World War, the World War that he was experiencing as he wrote this novel, the World War that readers had just gone through as they began to read the novel. MacLennan has an elegance of prose, a way of describing the Canadian landscape that few other authors I've encountered have been able to do. I know I've done this before, but I'm going to read the opening passage to this novel because it sticks with me. I've loved it since I first read it. Northwest of Montreal, through a valley always in sight of the low mountains of the Laurentian Shield, the Ottawa River flows out of Protestant Ontario into Catholic Quebec. It comes down broad and ale-colored and joins the St. Lawrence. The two streams embrace the pan of Montreal Island. The Ottawa merges and loses itself, and the main stream moves northeastward, 1,000 miles to the sea. Nowhere has nature wasted herself as she has here. There is enough water in the St. Lawrence alone to irrigate half of Europe. But the river pours right out of the continent into the sea. No amount of water can irrigate stones, and most of Quebec is solid rock. It is as though millions of years back in geologic time, a sword had been plunged through the rock from the Atlantic to the Great Lakes and savagely wrenched out again, and the pure water of the continental reservoir, unmuddied and almost useless to its farmers, drains untouchably away. That's not just a description of the land, that is a description of the lost potential that MacLennan sees draining out of Canada because those two solitudes cannot always embrace. I guess there's not really much more for me to say here other than please go read my favorite novel, Two Solitudes by Hugh MacLennan.